Welcome back to Psychology Applied to Work. This is Lecture 36, Stressors and Strains at Work. All right, our last lecture was a bonus lecture, and it was a video interview with Sarah from HR, and we talked about strategic human resources. I hope you watched that and found that interesting. Today we're going to talk about stressors and strains at work, which is the beginning of chapter 13 in the book. So hopefully you're reading each chapter as we get to them. If you read each one of the chapters and follow along in the lectures, it's pretty much all you need to do to be properly prepared for the tests. So today we're going to talk about what work stress is. We're going to talk about occupational health psychology, which is a domain that focuses on this area. And we're talking about the model of what's called the stress process. And we're going to talk about stressors at work. And we're going to talk about strains at work. All right, let's get into it. Work stress. What is work stress? So it can be physiological or it can be psychological. And it's typically the response to a stimuli. It's often an unpleasant stimuli, but it doesn't have to be explicitly specifically unpleasant. But it can also be a threat. And it's basically placing demands on you. It could be from threatening your resources. Sort of a broad way to look at, what is work stress is something that's going to cause you a response, an arousal response, an event, a context, a series of things that either means you have a physiological arousal response or a psychological arousal response, or somewhat tautological, but the things that make you feel stressed. All right, so it can be physiological, which is to say, it might increase your heart rate, it might increase your blood pressure, get cortisol or adrenaline flowing. These are ways in which your body responds to stress, and these are elements or dimensions of physiological arousal. Or it could be psychological response, which is to say it's getting you ready for a behavior. A way of looking at the psychological response is readiness for action. In some ways you can look at like all emotions. There's a way of looking, there's a perspective that looks at emotions as like action readiness patterns. Different types of emotions are predispose you for taking certain types of action. So you could even, holding on fairly loosely here to our framework, you could look at emotions are sort of predisposed, partially culturally derived, partially biologically derived action readiness patterns for different types of stressors in your environment or different types of opportunities. But not all stresses are bad, and we'll talk about that a little bit here. So physiological stress is like it's prepping your body for physical action. You're getting your heart rate going. Your breathing is going up. You're flooding your system with various types of chemicals like cortisol and adrenaline to help you push through things, to help you repair stuff in case they're damaged. And then psychological is like you're getting in a cognitive and affective state, predisposing you for action. Now, stress overall at work, it's a concern, definitely. In fact, about almost 2/3 of U.S. workers really describe their job as a significant source of stress in their lives. And fully 1/3 of workers describe their stress at work as chronic, which is to say, long-term, not ending, it's just always there, and it's always a source of stress. Now, chronic work stress is estimated to cost, almost $1/3 trillion due to lost performance, and that can be just people don't want to go to work, coming in late. It can be the health effects of medical and insurance costs that come from the health impacts of chronic stress. And stress is linked to counterproductive work behavior, CWBs, accidents, injuries, and lower job satisfaction. All right, so occupational health psychology, what is that? So that is a domain or subdomain of psychology. Recall there are lots and lots of domains and subdomains in psychology. And it's studying the health effects of job stress, as well as just overall employee well-being. And it emerged in 1990 when the American Psychological Association got together with NIOSH and said, hey, we really need to have a subdomain focusing on this. It isn't like all-encompassing in industrial organizational psychology. It's also bringing in health psychology, and it's sort of a subset of IO, but it also merges with some other stuff, and then it overlaps into the stuff that you're doing over there at NIOSH. So recall that NIOSH is the federal body looking at the researching of health and safety things at work, whereas OSHA, if you recall from our safety lectures, is the enforcement body. And OSHA is the one that comes in and says you need to do these things, and they can fine you if you're not, and they'll come in and do an investigation if there's an accident. But NIOSH is the one that's like studying, workplace conditions and health and providing that kind of guidance. So it's a kind of a natural partnership here with the APA to identify the need for a new subdomain. So hence the birth of occupational health psychology. Okay, let's get talking about what occupational health psychology, and I see I have a typo in here, OCP instead of OHB. My apologies for that. How did that get there? Anyway, OHB. Stressors, they can be looked at as challenges, hindrances, or threats, and we'll get into this in more detail here on this slide. So a stressor isn't necessarily the same, the same thing. How you respond to it is not the same. The same thing might not be a stressor to somebody else. It's really oftentimes context dependent upon you and what you're trying to do, and whether this thing it stands in your way and or has and then how you appraise it. Do you view it as a challenge? Do you view it as a hindrance, or do you view it as a threat? So stress is in this case, it can be good or bad depending upon how you interpret it. So it can be a motivator, for instance. So stress can be a challenge. Like, oh boy, this deadline has me really actually, excited. This makes this thing more meaningful. Or the deadline could be, oh crap, this scares the crap out of me. I don't know if I can do this. So again, your cognitive appraisal, which is to say your view, your perspective on this thing that we're calling a stressor, totally context dependent, and you're part of that context. What are the other things you're competing with that are competing for your time and attention? What are the stakes here? How do you assess your own ability to deal with this stress? All of that can result in, whether this thing skews positive or negative, and sort of how you appraise it. So, but in many cases, stress is viewed as a challenge, and getting through that stress is a learning and growth opportunity, and it gives you a sense of fulfillment and achievement. So stress isn't something, recall that, you get smarter by working your way through problems where you feel dumb, sort of embrace that feeling of dumb to kind of go, how does this work? And don't run away from that. That actually helps neuroplasticity. So in some ways, feeling dumb can make you smart. And same way with like weightlifting and strength training and that sort of thing, feeling weak can make you strong. By pushing past, safely, but pushing past, areas where you could otherwise easily do a particular set of weights in a routine, but by getting yourself past that, oh, I don't think I can do it, but you still push and you still get it done, again safely. That can actually trigger the types of sort of micro damage that results in repair mechanisms that actually build your muscle cells and their innervation to be literally stronger. So by embracing this feeling of weak, you get stronger. Now, embracing challenge, appraising a stress as a challenge is in some ways a mindset thing, and it actually can lead to growth and fulfillment and achievement. So in many ways, your response to stress can have a lot to do with your mindset. So whether stress is good or bad, and subsequently then what strains result from that stress, they have a lot to do with you. Not always. There's just things that if you absolutely have no control over it, certain stressors can be very straining and very negative. So on that note, stress can be a thing that is definitely a frustrator instead of a motivator. It can lower your overall satisfaction at work if it's viewed as a hindrance. It's like, this thing's in my way. This isn't in any way going to help me grow. I can't imagine this being a thing that I don't view this as a challenge. This is just I got to get this done, and no one's going to, thank me for it. But it's completely in my way, or I got to deal with it, or the air conditioning went out. It's 104 degrees and humidity and humid outside, and the air conditioning's out, and I'm trying to get this thing done, and now I'm just soaking wet, and I can't think, that's you might not look at that as a wonderful challenge that's going to make you be fulfilled. You might just look at that as, I wish this wasn't here. This is stressing me out. This is hurting my productivity. And then it can be a threat. Stress can be, your job is under threat. Obviously outside of work, it can be, you can have serious health concerns. You can have safety issues and other things. But from a work environment, there's just, hey, our budget's being cut. We don't know if everybody's job's going to be saved, and those sorts of things. That can definitely affect your sense of well-being. So again, stresses can be viewed as challenges that grow you. They can be hindrances that are in your way, or direct threats to your resources, health, and well-being. Hopefully, this is pretty straightforward and common sense to you. Okay, models of stress. When you hear the word model in psychology, a lot of times you end up with relatively simple box diagrams, and depending on how deep you go, you can certainly complexify them. But this is a simple stress strain. One thing leads to another type thing, with some moderation, which is the stressor can become strain, thus can become a strain. But there are lots of things that can moderate that, both good and bad. That can take a stress and reduce it so much that you don't see a strain, or reduce the effect of the strain, or things that moderate negatively, which is to say that amplifies the increases the strain for a given stress. And we're going to spend a lot of the next lecture talking about moderators, and we're just introducing the concept here as part of a stress model. There's also a thing called mediators and moderators, and that's not really what we need to get into here. It starts to get into it's a little more subtle. We're just strictly going to talk about a moderator, which is, you have a thing, stressor, that can cause another thing a strain, and a moderator can affect how much that one thing affects the other. Okay, so we're going to get into this stress process a little bit more. We've already talked about physiological and psychological, so we're just going to dig a little bit more into the context of this is around a stress process. Stress affects you in these ways. It affects you physiologically, it affects you psychologically, and that can result in these subsequent strains. And here are some things, again, next lecture, that can moderate that. So adrenal glands will release cortisol and adrenaline. Adrenaline will, give you a kind of intensity and energy, good for some sprints and some, fight or flight type stuff. And cortisol is going to flood you with chemicals that are basically priming you for utilizing as much of your metabolic waste as you can, getting ready to do repair processes and that sort of thing. And you want to be that's where we'll talk about we mentioned chronic stress. One of the things about like cortisol, for instance, is if you're in an environment, let's say you're a first responder, or you work in an emergency room, or you're just in a factory you got to have this job, and it's just really difficult, and everybody keeps quitting, and or whatever, or the budget's going down, and people are getting laid off, and there's less and less help, and the stress is there, and you really internalize that, and you're getting lots of cortisol day after day after day. One of the things that cortisol is for is repair, in anticipation of, I'm stressed, I'm about to have to fight a grizzly bear or whatever. Probably not fighting a grizzly bear, but long evolved mechanisms of I need to be physiologically aroused, and I could strain myself, I could hurt myself, and so this cortisol is going to help me with that. If that's being flooded in your body too much every day after day after day because of chronic stress, that actually can do real damage to your long-term physical health. Cortisol is extraordinarily well studied in health psychology, and chronic high levels of cortisol can be very bad for you, which is why stress needs to be moderated, and why you need to do recovery to keep stresses to be. You want stresses to be challenge oriented, and not hindrance or threat oriented. And when you inevitably deal with hindrance or threat stresses, you want to do things to recover from those things. And we'll talk about much more of that in the next lecture. You also, as part of your physiological response, have your sympathetic nervous system kicking in, activating systems. So it's elevating your heart rate, elevating your respiration rate, getting some glucose in your blood, glycogen to help muscles and your brain and that sort of thing. And then on the psychological response, again, that's readiness for action. So that can include fight or flight, that's a response that keys your brain and your body, for like fleeing. That's the flight part. I see I have another. I need to do better prep here. That says flight or flight. So think of that as fight or flight, which you should know that. My apologies, that's 2 typos now. So that's you're ready to ward off that stress source. That's the fight or running away, fleeing. So fight or flight. And then there's another thing called that you may not have heard of before, called tend and befriend. And that's a response where you might actually approach the stress. And this is typically so fight or flight, you can think of that as this is a big deal, I got to get out of here, or I got to fight. And that can, in a workplace that doesn't necessarily have to mean, it almost never means, physical fighting or running, but it can mean I got to back off this situation, or it can mean I got to confront this situation. And then tend or befriend is a different kind of response. And that can be where this stress is not just affecting me, this could be affecting the group, and I am going to increase my interpersonal interactions. I'm going to reinforce my bonds as a coping mechanism. So that might be a coping mechanism for you, your stress, so you're going to seek out the group, or it could be, where the stress appears to be affecting the whole group, and you have this need to be affiliative. And people respond in different ways in different contexts, and then there's individual differences of whether or not somebody is going to go to fight or flight or tend and befriend, and these aren't necessarily the entirety of ways in which we respond to stress. But fight or flight is something that you've probably heard many times, and tend and befriend you may or may not have. But hopefully this sort of makes sense. I mean, some people, they when things get really bad and stressful, they try to circle the wagons, they try to reassure people, or they try to self-reassure by holding hands with somebody or whatever. Or let's get the hell out of here, or let's confront this thing. All right, so the main takeaways here, besides the fight or flight and tend and befriend, is a reminder that you have physiological and psychological responses, a little bit of the details in it. And then when we get into moderators in the next lecture, we're going to have this basic block diagram model. And what we've just talked about is the various types of responses to stressors, which, leads us into, some more specific stressors at work. Okay, so stressor for again, they're situational, and this is somewhat, this is redundant or a tautology here, that a stressor is a situational aspect that leads to feeling stressed. What does it mean to have a stressor? Well, a stressor is a thing that makes you feel stressed. Okay, that is circular, but I think you understand what feeling stressed is, and that then if you think of a stressor, it's not like you can't typically take a stress out of context. So heat and humidity might be a stressor in a work environment, but heat and humidity might not be a stressor if you're on the beach, kind of thing. So situationally dependent things that cause you stress, and they can be physical stressors, and that would be workplace conditions that can stress your body. That air conditioning's broke example, or In the case of people who work, work outside and work really hard in trades, they can be just a regular situation of their workplace. I mean, deep coal miners can work in heat and all sorts of other stresses, and people who work like oil fields in the Arctic. Deep cold is a chronic thing. So these physical stressors might be like sort of structurally baked into the working conditions. You can't get rid of them, or they might come and go. But that's a physical stressor, and it can be job-related stress. So these would include, I've got too much to do. So it would be work overload, it's called. And that could be literally, I don't have enough time. So this quantitative work overload. I have X number of tasks, and I have less than X equivalent amount of time to do these tasks. I'm overloaded with work, and I can quantify it based upon the time versus the duties. Or it could be more qualitative, and that could be things like, I don't know how to do this. This task you're giving me is unachievable. I don't have the skills for this, or nobody has the skills for this, or there's just too many things countering each other here in a trade-off space, such that there really is no optimum. Job-related stressors include work overload. Aspects of work overload include quantitative, which is not enough time to get everything done, or qualitative, which is the work is too difficult. It can also mean too little work, or work underload. And work underload, can be its own source of stress and frustration, because you're bored, you want to get stuff done, you can't. Maybe you have to sit there. There's a lot of jobs in retail or whatever you're not supposed to look at your phone, but yet, if there's not a customer to work with, you're sort of standing by, staring off into space, and that can be its own form of stress. It can make you, agitated. You want to get going and doing things. It can be its own form of frustration. So not enough to do can be a stressor. And role ambiguity is certainly a stressor, which is I'm not sure exactly what I'm supposed to do here. I feel at cross purposes from what I thought my job was to what it appears my job is, and I can't quite figure this out. So I don't know how to do a good job, because I'm not exactly sure what my job is. And then role conflict, that's recall. And role ambiguity and role conflict we've introduced in previous lectures, and they certainly apply here because they can be stressors. That role conflict is where there's a mismatch between aspects of your job and your value system. So you're like, I'm uncomfortable. I feel like I'm being expedient here, and this is sort of a violation of my personal integrity to do these sorts of things. And that can be, you're sort of acting in antagonism to your own value system, which you have a lot of things that'll be tripping you up, going, don't do this, and that can cause a lot of stress. And stressors at work. And that's what we're talking about, recall, physical stresses at work, job-related stresses. And then, of course, you can have interpersonal stress at work. And that, name your human you're interacting with, and it's potentially an interpersonal source of stress. And that could be how you're getting along with, the expectations set by your manager or supervisor, how well do your personalities align, how good are their leadership skills, are they treating you, do you feel respected? Or are they creating role conflict or role ambiguity, or are they causing work overload or work underload? But also your peers and your coworkers, your customers, clients, maybe suppliers, all the ways in which you're interacting with people. And it can also be basically there's poor team dynamics at work. You might have poor leadership. You might have interpersonal conflict with any one individual that happens to be either you just don't get along with this person, or they're incivil, or they're toxic, or whatever. And then you can have kind of like a mood, like a contagion. Like everybody's in a foul mood, everybody's in a cynical mood, everybody's demotivated, and so the interpersonal stress is more diffuse. You can't really pin it to one particular individual, but it's like this undercurrent of everybody's just sort of, nobody's looking at anybody in the eye, nobody's saying good things. They just, feel, and it can obviously take a form of hostility too, but it also can have just sort of low grade incivility or whatever that can just feel like a kind of interpersonal stress, because you're getting cues from what was supposed to be your in-group, right? That maybe you don't belong. or maybe everybody's acting like nobody's belongs, which is sort of like a direct affront to the binding narrative, to the whole in-group, and then that creates uncertainty for you. And that's it, kind of at the core to all of this stuff, is like, what is stress? And certainly, the psychological stress. One of the easiest heuristics to look at it is what's causing uncertainty. In what way is this thing? It's definitely a stressor because I can feel it, or I can see it in this person and how they react. If you drill into like, how was uncertainty being created here, or how has the level of certainty of what the future is going to look like been reduced? And a lot of times that can be that approach can help identify like, what is this stress? And then what I was just given in an example where it just feels like everybody's in kind of a foul mood. Well, why would that be a stress? And again, it'd be because you're not getting good signals that you're in a secure, happy in-group that's stabilizing you and helping you secure your future. You now have uncertainty about the quality of your in-group, or the commitment of your fellow in-group members, in this case coworkers. And so, where is this thing going to go? Is this going to be successful, or is everybody just going to go their own way and disengage? And does that mean the company's going to lose business and I'm not going to get a raise anymore? And in 3 years from now, we're not going to be able to pay bills, and we're going to be out of work, and I'm going to be fired, and I got a mortgage, and I'm trying to get my kids through college. And all of a sudden, you went from, I know who I am, I'm feeling in a good place, to my coworkers are giving me this weird vibe, and now I'm worried about everything. I mean, kind of being an extreme example, but that the message here is that uncertainty causes stress. And in some regards, that is what stress is, which is your future is less certain than it was a moment ago if your stress went up. Even physical stress. There's a threat at play, or something else is at play. Things are cueing you to be physiologically aroused. That's because you got to take some action. And if you don't take action, things could be bad. And similarly with psychological stress, really think about that a lot in your lives, because it does help you as a stress management mechanism to understand that uncertainty is at its core, and how much of your future you look out towards and how much of it you basically count on can actually lead to how you deal with your stress. And in many ways, some people who there's way too much uncertainty the more forward they look. Say they live in a low socioeconomic, low opportunity, high crime, highly variable world, in some neighborhood or developing nation or whatever, that you just can't count on 5 years, let alone 10. And you can barely count on like 1 year. So the future's so uncertain that you actually can find that the people's time scale that they focus on, it gets narrower and narrower and narrower to where they can cope and they can find certainty. And that is somewhat of a stress mechanism, because if you actually were really future focused all the time in a highly volatile environment, it would just be chronic uncertainty, because you just wouldn't know what to long-term plan on. Anyway, we're getting into the weeds a little bit. The important thing to remember here is that stress, uncertainty, at some level they're the same. At least one is the manifestation of the other, which is the level of uncertainty you have associated with your goals and who you are, and that sort of, and where you're going, and that sort of thing. When you encounter things in your life, when you're unfolding your plan and it's not unfolding the way you thought, you'll find yourself to be stressed. Now that's good or bad. Again, it can be a challenge, that can be a hindrance, or can be a threat. To some extent, your mindset actually can affect how you appraise that, and certainly your mindset can affect, whether am I an agent in my own life, or am I passive, and all these things are done to me. All the things we've talked about throughout the class, hopefully, you can see are relevant here. Okay, let's keep going. So strains, we talked about stressors. Let's talk about strains at work. So again, the strain is sort of the outcome of the stress process. Or what happens when you encounter a stressor. And you can have a physiological strain, which is to say you have some sort of symptom, some sort of ailment, some sort of way in which this physically manifests in the body. I'm stressed. I have, that would be, chronic cortisol. It can have all sorts of can give you all sorts of ailments, but lots of ways here that this can show up. So musculoskeletal issues, which is like the stressors are, we don't have anything to help us lift, and I've got to use these heavy tools, and I got to do this other stuff, and now my muscles are sore, my backs are sore, my joint is sore, or this stress is causing me to have immunological suppression. It's giving me colds. This stress and anxiety, this level of uncertainty is giving me gastrointestinal difficulties, or it's making it difficult for me to sleep. And again, psychological as well. You can have physiological stress and psychological stress. You can have physiological strain and you can have psychological strain. And psychological strain, those are symptoms that we would typically associate with mental health. We associate that with emotional states and moods. And that can be, this stress is making me feel angry. This stress has got me feeling depressed. These stressors have me anxious. I'm dealing with anxiety because of that. Or all these stressors have me overwhelmed. And they can be behavioral. And obviously this would be tied to psychological, in the sense that your psychological state is your psychology drives your behavior, your cognition drives your behavior. But really, from looking at a strain, you can have behavioral strain, which is like, what are the actions you're taking for your health while under stress? And that can mean like stress eating. That's a behavior that isn't necessarily good. I mean, sometimes like, that was a hard day. I want some chicken soup, man. I just want to settle down and have some comfort food. It isn't always a bad thing, but some people look to eating as a coping mechanism, as a behavior that is itself can be a strain, which is in the form of like chronic stress eating and exercise. And there's certainly too much exercise that can happen. You can having sleep is a decent response, but you can get to the point where that can be, I don't ever leave the bed and start getting depressive symptoms and that sort of thing. You can cope with alcohol, you can cope with drugs, you can cope with smoking. And then there can be job-related strain, which is you get performance problems. You're not doing the level of performance you used to because of these stressors. It's causing you to have attitudes at work that's affecting your interpersonal side of things. It can cause, not coming into work and just overall disengagement. All right. I told you it was a short lecture today. There's a few more slides when we talk about moderators for the second half of chapter 13, but hopefully this was pretty straightforward and interesting to you. So we talked about stressors and strains at work, and particularly what is work stress. We talked about the creation of occupational health psychology. We talked about model, the stress strain with moderators model or of the stress process. And we talked about stressors at work, and we talked about strains at work. And so next lecture, when we get into this other half of chapter 13, we're going to talk about stress moderators. So, what do we mean by moderators of stress and strain? And so some of them include recovery and sleep, work life, and how work life, work and your non-work kind of thing, how some of those imbalances affect moderation, both good and bad. We're going to talk about burnout, and we're going to talk about interventions. Okay, that's the end of the lecture, and we will see you for lecture 37.